Slava Ukraini! Blink if you've heard the latest news about the Ukrainian counteroffensive and it sparks a lot of joy for you. I've just blinked twice because seeing these heartwarming videos of civilians in deoccupied villages greeting Ukrainian soldiers makes me so happy. They say they'd been waiting for the armed forces of Ukraine for half a year and they're so grateful now that they are free. You might have seen how one woman even offered just baked pancakes to her liberators. That was so sweet that it made me cry. Another video I love is about Ukrainians tearing down a poster that read, "We are one nation with Russia." Underneath that, nonsense to say the least, was a beautiful poster of Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko and a quote of his poem that said, if translated literally, "Fight and you will overcome, for God helps you. For you is the truth, for you is the glory and the sacred freedom." It's so symbolic that it looks like a movie scene. That town was literally liberated, deoccupied, and decolonized in all ways possible. The poster is one of the proofs. This is a small victory, one of those hundreds of small victories that make the big triumph. Also, blink if you've seen the picture of the torture victims in just liberated Izum. The mass burial in the forest. The emaciated hand with the blue and yellow bracelet. We saw it before in Bucha in 2022. We saw it in Bukovina in 1937. And after all this, the Russian dare say that we are one nation. We are not. Please remember these pictures if you'd ever want to become the Russians' apologist. I wouldn't be myself, though, if I didn't pay way too much attention to that disgusting Russian propaganda poster and overanalyzed it out loud. They say that Ukrainians and Russians are the same nation, and this is one of their main destructive narratives. Believing it, one can become the aggression apologist easily. To people influenced by the Russian propaganda, Ukraine and Russia don't seem to be separate sovereign states, but sort of a metropolis and a colony that went astray and must be returned because it's one nation. Obviously, to support the one nation myth, ideology makers should address the language issue somehow. This is how another nonsense, I'm just on the point of swearing, myth was born that the Ukrainian language doesn't exist. Throughout the past 300 years, it was called dialectic, artificial, primitive, second rate, everything to suppress Ukrainians, assimilate them, and make the world believe in Russian supremacy. Why any nation should be supreme to the other in the 21st century after the painful lessons of World War II is a mystery to me. Every Ukrainian, however, knows all too well how, step by step, Russia had been destroying Ukrainian culture, especially language. This is a painful story of a phoenix who got burned so many times it forgot it had once been alive. Prepare your chamomile tea because this is gonna be a hard one. I'm Michelle Bonder, this is Ukraine in a nutshell, and today I'll answer you such a simple and complicated question. Why did so many Ukrainians used to speak Russian? I guess it was the longest intro so far. I'll let you know when I beat my personal record. So, the first thing I want you to understand is that Ukrainians are primarily bilingual, though not by their conscious choice. The reason we can speak Russian is the same reason the Pakistani can speak English or the Algerians can speak French. It's colonialism and its awful consequences. Some statistics. According to the 2001 population census, almost 68% of Ukrainians responded that Ukrainian is their native language, and 29% gave this status to Russian. The rest chose the languages of national minorities. The statistics vary by region. Russian was largely selected in Crimea and other southern and eastern parts of Ukraine, while Ukrainian prevailed in the west and north. The statistics didn't display a common linguistic phenomenon in Ukraine. Many people speak Surzhyk, the mix between Ukrainian and Russian, daily. When asked about my native language, I always say that it's both Ukrainian and Russian. I come from the eastern region though, that's why I used to speak Russian much more and talked in Ukrainian only in class. However, according to the first known population census on Ukrainian lands in 1897, Ukrainian was native to 70.7% people, which is 3% more than in 2001, and The number for Russian was 9.6%. As you remember, in 2001 it'll triple. How was this possible in just 100 years? Let's figure it out. Ukrainian was heavily oppressed in the 19th century Russian Empire, though the attempts forbidden to speak it date as far back as the 17th century when Russia started occupying Ukraine. Schools were Russified entirely, and Ukrainian typography was very limited. For example, in 1863, the Moscow Tsar adopted the Valuyev Circular that forbade publishing books in Ukrainian except for fiction. Scientific and religious texts were only allowed to be published in Russian, and it had a huge negative impact on Ukrainian culture. Imagine, there were no social networks, and books, the only source of information and education tools, were controlled by the state. This circular was an example of Russian chauvinism because it literally said that there's no such thing as the Ukrainian language, never has been and can't be. Those who don't understand it are the enemies of the Russian Empire. Imagine having someone telling you that your native language with a 1,000-year history doesn't exist. I bet you'd want to punch these hypocrites in the face. At least that's what I definitely enjoy. You think that the Valuyev Circular was awful? Well, you haven't heard of the Am's Decree of 1876 yet. Let me tell you what it prohibited this time, though it's easier to list the things it didn't prohibit. Any original books or translations in Ukrainian, forbidden. Theater pieces in Ukrainian, banned. You're Ukrainian and you want to teach kids in Ukrainian at school? No, we'll immediately replace all Ukrainian teachers with Russian ones. By the way, that's what Russians do in 2022 on temporarily occupied territories. Same old imperial strategy. Even importing books in Ukrainian from abroad and printing sheet music lyrics in Ukraine was forbidden. After the M's decree, many Ukrainian cultural figures were forced to immigrate and continue the national struggle outside Ukraine. My favorite Ukrainian poet Lina Kostenko once said, "Nations don't die of a heart attack. First, they are made speechless." I couldn't have said it better, because the language is literally the soul of the nation, and the Ukrainian soul was forbidden in the Russian Empire. All this isn't the evilest thing possible that could be done to a language. Have you ever heard of the term linguicide? That's the favorite thing of the Russian government after the genocide. The term is self-explanatory. It means the murder of the language. It is a part of linguistic imperialism, and that sucks. The goal of linguicide is the assimilation of the ethnic group, forcing the whole nation to think that it isn't really a nation, and thus justifying the colonial occupation. Rhyme unintended. The Ukrainian language experienced different forms of linguicide throughout its long history. In the Russian Empire, it was forbidden and rejected. But after the Soviet occupation, the USSR government did something worse than that. A little history note for you. After the collapse of the Russian Empire in 1917, thank God, previously enslaved peoples developed national movements and started building their own independent states. Ukraine did so too, but just in a few months it had to fight the Red Soviet Army, the White Imperialist Russian Army, and the Polish Army, in that order and then simultaneously. The young state couldn't resist such horrible pressure, and it was eventually occupied by the USSR. I must mention that Ukrainians were not entirely happy with losing their independence, so the Soviet officials had to trick them into thinking that communism and the new government were fun. That's how the process of indigenization in national republics started. Indigenous people, like Ukrainians in Ukraine, were able to join the Communist Party and be appointed to high regional posts. All officials were required to speak the local language fluently, regardless of their nationality. The state encouraged the development of indigenous languages and supported the cultural events in those languages. Ukrainian culture was thriving in the 20s. New theater troupes, literary circles, art schools, film factories sprang up like mushrooms after the rain. That's because the artists had the hope that after years of fighting against imperialism, they finally got the rights and recognition they deserve. Back in the day, they called this cultural phenomenon the Red Renaissance. Moreover, in 1928, the government financed the adoption of Ukrainian orthography. Many academic figures from across Ukraine took part in unifying the standards of the language according to how it really was spoken in different regions of the country. You might think, just like Ukrainians back then thought, that everything was just fine. Though in the 20s, Simon Petlura, head of the Ukrainian People's Republic in exile, rated this tricky indigenization like this. In this direction of the current policy of the Bolsheviks, I see the next concession to the spontaneous force of the Ukrainian national movement, and at the same time a logically consistent and a political measure aimed at mastering the power of this movement and strengthening its positions in Ukraine. His saying aged well, so now we'll just skip to the bad part. The 1930s is one of the worst decades in human history, in my opinion. In 1933, Hitler came into power while Stalin realized that the Soviet position in Ukraine were really threatened by now. Indigenization and new economic policy in the 20s lulled Ukrainian vigilance and national movement. That's why when nobody could fight the regime, it could easily become totalitarian. No wonder 1994 was inspired by the USSR, because now I'll tell you something awfully Orwellian. Do you know why we don't use the term the Red Renaissance anymore? It is known in Ukraine as розстріляне відродження, the shot rebirth. It isn't a metaphor. Hundreds of Ukrainian cultural figures were sentenced to death, and thousands were sent to forced labor camps for bourgeois nationalism. The elite of Ukrainian culture was killed or exploited for speaking Ukrainian and for loving Ukraine. Mykola Skripnik, the Ukrainian Bolshevik who was faithful to communism ideology and adopted the 1928 orthography, committed suicide in 1933. He was driven to it because of his views, which were partly different from the ones of the party. Imagine, he dared say that Ukrainian culture is separate from Russian. Naturally, the orthography he adopted was recognized as heresy. In 1933, Soviet politicians, without the help of any linguists, adopted the new orthography and started a campaign of Russification all over again. Remember Newspeak from 1984? The dictionaries of this language were strategic tools to narrow down one's vocabulary so that no unorthodox thought would cross the mind of the proper socialist. In Ukrainian real-life dictionaries, they forbade authentic Ukrainian words to eliminate the artificial differences between Russian and Ukrainian. Ah, yes, the artificial differences between two different languages. And this was the real linguicide. So many words and scientific terms were lost because they were all Russified. The grammar was changed to look more like Russian. The literary elite was all repressed. Their works were forbidden until the USSR collapsed, and afterwards they were unknown to most Ukrainians, so few people learned about them. The Renaissance that was shot was now forgotten, which is even worse. But the most horrible thing in the years to come was that Ukrainian was used less and less. Stalin's government loved torturing people. One of their favorite things was forced deportation. Ukrainians and representatives of other nations who even slightly disagreed with the regime were sent to inhabitable regions in the Far East. They were mostly replaced by Russians, coming to their motherland and taking their houses. The most famous deportations happened in 1944 in Crimea, when 183,000 Crimean Tatars were deported to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc., and in 1947 when 203,000 Ukrainians from the westernmost regions were deported to Russia. Those smaller acts of human rights violation like this happened all the time in the USSR. This led to huge changes in the national composition of Ukraine. At the beginning of the 19th century, Russians made up 8% of the total population. In 1989, after all the deportations and machinations, and when the Empire of Evil lived out its last days, this figure increased to 26%. The share of Crimean Tatars in the population was criminally small in years after the deportation because they were forbidden to come back to their motherland until the USSR collapsed. There is no need to say that the national composition influenced the number of people who spoke certain languages in certain territories. The Crimean Tatar language was almost forgotten. Ukrainian discriminated against. And the Russian language thrived in the USSR, the dream country where everything and everyone were equal. Sarcasm. The story of Russification didn't end after Stalin's death. Oftentimes, the tyranny doesn't end when the tyrant is gone. It's the system that needs changing, not the governmental face. So, in 1958, they adopted the law on free choice of language of education. Study of all languages except Russian was at the request of the students' parents. To make it clear, Ukrainian wasn't mandatory to learn in Ukraine, but Russian was. What? Most newspapers in the post-Stalin Soviet era were in Russian. Only 10 to 20 of books in Ukrainian libraries were in Ukrainian. Even those few movies in Ukrainian were required to be dubbed in Russian. That's some toxic colonial behavior, isn't it? To get a PhD, Ukrainian scientists had to write a thesis in Russian and defend it only in Moscow. In 72% of schools in Ukraine, they taught everything in Russian. Do you think Brezhnev, the head of the Soviet government from 1966 till 1982, who was born in Ukraine, made it any easier for the Ukrainians of our language? It's the other way around. Under his rule, there were two large waves of dissident arrests. Again, like in Stalin times, Ukrainian cultural figures were imprisoned for their beliefs and love for Ukraine. It was another act of damage to the Ukrainian language because many of the imprisoned were writers and poets. Vasil Stus, one of the dissidents and greatest Ukrainian poets, was almost nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1985 but died in a cell. Reed was killed by the regime. And this is just one example of a broken life in that Russified society. After Brezhnev in 1983, another linguicide law was adopted. According to it, Russian language and literature teachers would be paid 16% more than Ukrainian ones. Of course, young teachers would choose the more profitable specialty, and it would lead to Ukrainian going extinct eventually because literature and art were as well as forbidden, and the language was not taught at school. Thank goodness this communist empire fell apart and Ukrainian was reborn like a phoenix once more. It endured a lot of damage, though, throughout so many years of discrimination. My mom comes from a small town and in the 90s and 2000s was anxious about speaking Ukrainian in the city because Russian was considered cool, urban, and modern, while Ukrainian was thought to be provincial. But there's no damage Ukrainians can't repair. In 2019, our government adopted the new old orthography that followed the 1928 repressed Skrupnikivka, going back to the roots. That year, they also adopted the law protecting the Ukrainian language. Ever since 2019, all governmental institutions, TV channels and media, shops, schools, and other vital infrastructure employees resorted to speaking Ukrainian daily. It only improves as the years pass. People start speaking Ukrainian even after a lifetime of thinking in Russian. This tragic story does have a happy ending. As of 2022, 76% of Ukrainians consider Ukrainian their native language, compared to 57% in 2012. 48% of Ukrainians talk only in Ukrainian, 33% both in Ukrainian and Russian. 60% of that 33% are about to switch to Ukrainian only. And it will only improve because Ukrainian freedom have the future, something that Russia and imperialism can never afford. Other empires like Russia lost colonies, but for them the loss of the empire did not mean the loss of their nation state. For Russia, the loss of the empire means the loss of the state. That's all for today, folks. I hope this story helps you understand how painful was the colonial past of Ukraine, especially considering the language. I chose the title for this episode, Why So Many Ukrainians Used to Speak Russian, on purpose. I know that a lot of us still do, but I hope that one day we'll all speak English or any other foreign language as fluently as Russian instead of it. Not because it was imposed on us, but because we chose to educate ourselves. By the way, the Ukrainian language was not the only one that suffered Russification. In different history periods, Russia or the USSR tried to forcibly make Latin languages such as Lithuanian, Moldovan, and Kazakh Cyrillic. They changed the alphabets so that the orthography would look more like the Russian one. The language was created for communication, but Russian imperialism used and continues using it as its best tool. They won't be able to do it after Ukraine's hopefully soon victory, though, so let's make it sooner by donating to trusted Ukrainian funds. End the era of colonialism. This is within your power. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode, which will be released. Oh, when it is released. Have a great day. Glory to Ukraine.